Oh,
Well, good evening, everyone. We're so glad to have you with us this evening for what promises to be an excellent discussion on the climate emergency and the importance of a plant-based diet in addressing that. So I'm delighted to have our three speakers with us this evening. I think I will just do a brief introduction of them all to begin with for you to join me in welcoming them. We have David Steele, who is the president of Earthsave Canada, a molecular biologist retired from the UBC Faculty of Medicine, who also held faculty positions at Cornell and Queen's University. We have Jason Hanna, is a professor at the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communications at the University of Winnipeg. His books include Meatsplaining, The Animal Agriculture Industry and the Rhetoric of Denial, Sydney University Press, 2020, and Trolling Ourselves to Death, Democracy in the Age of Social Media, Oxford University Press, 2023, which I'm delighted to say won the Irving Goffman Award for the Media Ecology Association. And then, of course, last but not least, Eleanor Carrara is the co-founder and president of the Plant-Based Cities Movement and founder of the Canadian University Initiative. And were we in person, I'm sure you would all join me in welcoming them, as we're delighted to have them with us this evening. So we'd like to ask you to ask the questions that may come to your mind and perhaps drop them into chat so that we can address them at the end of each presentation. So don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. Laura has gratefully volunteered to monitor those for us. And so I'd like to welcome David to begin our discussion this evening. Please take it away, David.
Thank you. Dennis, can you share the slides, given our problem otherwise? Thanks. Thank you very much. So there. Well, I'll be speaking on the environmental aspects of our diets, and this is an excerpt from a longer talk that I give fairly often, and I call it the Examined Diet: How Our Food Choices Affect Us and the Web of Life Around Us. Dennis, can you give me the next slide, please? I'm speaking from Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and we acknowledge that we are on their land without permission. Next slide, please. I'm going to be speaking about our food's outsized footprint on the environment, global warming, air and water pollution, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. I won't be speaking on the health issues, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to entertain them. Next slide, please. This is a palm oil plantation in Borneo, so palm oil is doing rather dramatic damage, like being the most, quote, efficient oil we can use. It's resulting in the mass devastation of wildlife and forests in Borneo. And palm oil is quite seriously damaging, but it's not the worst. This is a picture of the Amazon deforestation for beef, where beef cattle are raised, and then soy is grown to feed farmed animals also on that land where the forest is destroyed. As you can see, neither is doing the world much good, and the damage in the Amazon is extreme. Matter of fact, so extreme that last year, for the first time, it was estimated that the Amazon may have been a net contributor to global warming rather than a sink, and that's pretty scary. Mm-hmm. Next slide. So one important thing to keep track of in Canada's problem is saying getting stats for Canada is much harder, but for Canada, for the United States at least, only 2% of U.S. farmland is used to grow fruits and vegetables, and 59% is devoted to commodity crops, and the majority of those commodity crops are going for animal agriculture. Next slide, please. I can barely read it. I've forgotten the source. USDA, I believe. This is the acres in thousands devoted to various things: cereal, grains, oil crops, etc. Note the green, which is vegetables, fruits, and nuts. It's a tiny proportion of the crop acreage in the United States, and Canada is undoubtedly similar. Next slide, please. In Canada, we used to be, this is a quote from Toronto Star from last year. The article is, "It's the end of lettuce, why Canada's food supply is headed to uncharted territory." We used to be way more self-sufficient in fresh fruits and vegetables. We produce a lot more of what we consume domestically. But since World War II, all that has seriously deteriorated. because we're not supporting it. We're supporting commodity crops, which mostly support animal agriculture. Next slide, please. And by far, animal agriculture is the biggest impact. Next slide, please. So these are some stats I've been citing for 20 years now, and they haven't changed much. Over 70% of crops grown in North America go to animal feed, and these days also biofuels. Farmed animals in North America produce each year roughly 3 tons of manure for every person on the continent. And unfortunately, Canadians' per capita meat consumption has increased fourfold since 1900, twofold since 1950, although it is declining slightly these days. Next slide, please. It took me a while to find stats on this, but the Canadian Livestock Feeds, the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada, rather, does provide stats, and I found them there. I hope they're reliable. They claim that 80% of Canada's barley, 60% of corn, and 30% of wheat goes to feeding animals in Canada and across the world. Also, some of it is for export. Next slide, please. This is what we use that stuff for. We mostly feed swine with the crops we grow, followed by beef cattle, dairy cattle, poultry, and others. So as you can see, we're in Manitoba, I do believe, is a major pig farming area or pig factory farming area, and that's pigs don't go live on the range at all, so they get the greatest proportion of the feed grain. Again, from the Animal Nutrition Association of Canada statistics from 2022. Next slide, please. Why is this so? Well, animal agriculture is outrageously inefficient, actually. Next slide. From a fellow Manitoban from Vaclav Smil's work. This is a chart he published originally in 2002. 2000, I believe. I got it from a book I have of his called General Energetics and Complex Systems. I guess I can't use my pointer, so I'll just have to tell you. I was going to use my pointer for the slides, but I can't. So just pay attention to the gray boxes, okay? If you note, the amount of feed to get a pound of milk is less than a pound. That's because milk is mostly water. But for eggs, the eggs we eat, not excluding the shell, it takes about 4.2 pounds of feed to get 1 pound of eggs. Chicken's comparable. Pork is over 10 pounds. And it's nearly 32 pounds of feed to get 1 pound of the beef we eat. And that's pretty outrageously inefficient. That's really obvious. We look at the protein conversion efficiency. Only 40% of the protein we feed to dairy cows comes back in the milk we get. So we've wasted 60% of the protein. Eggs, 30% comes back to us. We threw away 70%, threw away 75% of the protein we fed chickens. 87% of the protein we fed to pigs basically became poo and other waste. And 95% of the protein we feed to cattle is lost. That never makes it into a human mouth. That's Vaclav Smil of the University of Manitoba, I do believe, although retired now. Next slide, please. This shows a summary of our world data of the land use for the various purposes. We're going to pay attention to the red, which is all of the Americas, and the purple, which is mostly China over there. The red was all the land devoted to animal agriculture. That includes raising the livestock directly and the feed to feed them. And China, the area of China, they're showing basically 7% of the cropland of the world's arable land is used for feeding humans directly. Those are crops fed to feed humans. And if you do 7 over 34, which is 7 plus 27, you'll note that's about 20% of the land we use to feed ourselves is directly feeds humans. 80% roughly feeds animals. Next slide, please. And those, of course, those animals are being outrageously inefficiently fed. This is from International Business Times several years ago. I liked it because they're talking about what to invest in given the water problems in California at the time. And they noted that beef was a really bad investment because it's largely raised in the West, and the West is very dry. And it takes enormous amounts of water to get a kilogram of beef. I believe it's hard for me to see on this thing, but I believe it's about 15,000 this is gallons or liters? Yes, liters per kilogram to get beef. It's even chicken's very inefficient. Cotton's inefficient, but as the article notes, and you can all notice reasonably, Cotton's mostly grown in areas where it rains a lot, and that's water cycle water. Beef, unfortunately, is largely raised on water that's coming out of the ground, and that groundwater is being rapidly depleted. If you compare it to rice, rice is quite inefficient because we flood the paddies, but it can be grown more efficiently than that. Corn is quite inefficient as crops go because it transpires a lot, and that's part of why the beef's so high and the chicken's so high. And if pork was on there, the pork would be so high. It's because it fed so much corn. If you look down here, potatoes only take to get a kilogram of potatoes only takes 287 liters of water, and it's not on here, but soy, if you calculate it, it's around 260. Next slide, please. And this is all resulting in a terrible crisis. Biodiversity loss is enormous. We're having extinction crises, as you're probably all aware. And as this is basically the UN FAO and Chatham House worked together and produced a report and discovered that agriculture is threatening 86% of at-risk species, and about 70% of that risk is due to animal agriculture directly. The greatest loss, of course, is in the tropics, because we're destroying the Amazon rainforest, etc., primarily for cattle, soy to feed the cattle, and palm oil production. Again, about 70% or more of that is due to animal agriculture. And all of that to get 18% of our global calories. We use 80% of our land to get 18% of our global calories. Next slide, please. And perhaps most shocking, this is the second slide. Volkov-Smith also had a study of showing a similar thing about 2010 or so. I wasn't convinced, he didn't give enough details, so I wasn't sure. But this came out in 2018, and there's another study since then. They're all these studies are in the same basic ballpark. If you look at mammals, about 60% of all the mammals on Earth by weight, the biomass of mammals and weight, are livestock, but animals humans are raising. 36% of biomass by weight is humans. And in this study, about 4%, other studies 5 or 6% are wild animals. There's mild variation. The error bars are relatively big, but the basic results are pretty obvious. We have basically decimated wild animals. We are the dominant species, us and the animals we raise. Even birds are not doing too well. 70% of the biomass of birds in the world are turkeys and chickens and the animals we raise. Only 30% are wild birds. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, the destruction is accelerating. Between 2007 and 2012, the most recent data available from the ISPPES is substantially higher than it was in the previous period they studied, was 2000, 2006. Matter of fact, 29% higher. So we're accelerating our clearing of land for agriculture, mainly to feed the livestock. Next slide, please. More startling statistics about to move into segue into the next section. Cattle produce so much methane each year that their immediate effect on global warming is comparable to that of all the cars in the world. Most topsoil loss is due to animal farming, mostly raising the crops for them, but also due to the damage they do to the soil. And soil runoff, including fertilizer and animal waste, is responsible for huge dead zones across the world, the most prominent one being the roughly 10,000 square mile dead zone that appears every year in the Gulf of Mexico. Lake Erie is also affected every single year by massive algal blooms, which creates dead zones and toxic water. People of Toledo, Ohio know that all too well. A few years ago, their water was poisoned. They could only drink bottled water because of the algal bloom due to basically runoff from animal farms, factory farms in Ohio and Michigan and southern Ontario.
That's happening here in Manitoba with our Lake Winnipeg is being destroyed by our hog industry.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Next slide, please. Segueing into global warming. I picked one of many papers I could chosen. The food system is responsible for more than a quarter, some estimate roughly close to a third of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Largely depends on how you count methane, but roughly 80% are associated with livestock production. Thus, if we as a society choose to move away from animal agriculture, we can dramatically reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. This is global warming. This is from Poor Nemechek from 2018. Global warming measures for various foods. Note, I wish I could use a pointer, but I can't. Note beef at the top, outrageous emissions per kilogram of food. And look down at potatoes, nuts, bananas. The plant-based items are outrageously less damaging. Next slide, please. This slide's a bit older and the estimates are lower, but I like to use it because it's two reasons. From an old friend, David Pimentel, who was a friend of mine in my Cornell days, and he was no longer with us, unfortunately, and because it breaks down, was the first work to break down the emissions due to production versus transportation. And as you note, the green is emissions due to production. I wish we could.
With you guys?
Pardon?
Oh, careful.
Yeah.
We need to mute. Someone's unmuted. One of our guests is unmuted. Please mute
You
yourself.
go for supper?
Ruben, thank you.
There we go. Good. Thank you. So the green is production associated and the red is transportation associated. As you note, you probably can't see it so well. I was big enough. I hope you can. I can't. For me, it's small. Beef is on the left, and the vast majority, of course, is production. That's mostly the methane and other methane they produce as ungulates, as well as methane from their manures, as it's stored, production emissions from their fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. Transportation of the product itself is dramatically lower in the red. And that's true for all the animal products. And you'll note potatoes are a little odd here in David's work here. It looks like potatoes almost nothing from production, enormous amount from transportation, not just transportation and post-processing. And that's because it's potato. He included potato chips and French fries, which are the major ways that America, this is a study about the United States, that the Americans eat potatoes. And so for potatoes are an outlier in that transportation and post-production processing are major contributors to their input, to their footprint, but that's only because of the way we eat potatoes. And the plant-based items, you know, not surprisingly, transportation is a bigger portion of the plant-based items because production produces almost no emissions, and some of them, of course, are much lower than those from the animal products. Next slide, please. This is from NASA's Goddard. This is from NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Science. And I don't know why the difference between non-Western cattle, but cattle, as you can see, are major methane emitters. Sheep also ungulates emit emissions per year quite significantly. And pigs, this actually is an underestimate because of factory farming, pigs produce more than that now, but direct emissions from pigs about 1.5 kilograms. And humans, because we do eat beans and things, do produce the methane, but it's nothing compared to the others. Next slide, please. This is why pigs have become much more significant methane producers, because we liquefy their manure and let it rot in waste lagoons where, of course, anaerobic degradation happens, and that releases methane. Next slide, please. And a study from Marco Springman's group at Oxford. He's an associate of Poor Nemechek as well. North Americans need to reduce our meat consumption by 79% by 2050 to meet net zero emissions goals. Next slide, please. And speaking of Canada, this is from the Club of Rome, etc. And that was, they studied, I believe, that's the next slide will tell me, to study several Western countries and other countries, several countries in the world, not only Western, and looked at the emissions profiles of the countries. You can see Canada by far was the most significant contributor to global warming. I wish I could show you in the pointer, but if you look at the bottom, you can see 2050 and 2030, the lines go up. Those are the limits we have to live within for carbon emissions by those years if we're going to reach net zero by 2050. Canada is nowhere near, and you note that food is a big contributor. It's not the biggest. Transportation is the biggest for Canadians, but it's a major contributor. And it's much, food is also nasty. We're not the only country heavy on food, but food is one of the easiest ones we can deal with. And we can go to the next slide, please. Canada's emissions, of course, surpassed those of all those countries in almost every category. Most importantly, the researchers noted that meat is an emissions hotspot for Canada. The only thing they could do better as a Canadian to reduce your personal emissions was to go car-free. So adopting a vegan diet, they explicitly stated, is second only to going car-free to reduce our personal carbon footprints. Next slide, please. But there is a lot of hope, actually. Choosing your food wisely is good for you and everyone else on the planet. I won't be covering very much here, but I'll show a little bit on the latest science. Next slide, please. In October 2020 in Nature, the Strasbourg et al. Published global priority areas for ecosystem restoration, which they noted rewilding just 15% of current agricultural land. That means if we stopped, which would be very easy for us to do if we stopped raising animals, because 3/4 of the land we're using, for 80%, depending on the estimate, of the land we're using is being used for animal agriculture. So if we would dramatically reduce animal agriculture, we could easily rewild large portions of the world. So if we were just 15%, we could remove 30% of the CO2 over the next few decades that has been emitted since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. We could prevent some 60% of the extinctions we now expect. And if we were to double that and restore 30% of agricultural land, we could sequester fully half the carbon we poured into the atmosphere since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and rescue another 10% of the species now expected to go extinct. Next slide, please. And at about the same time, a paper study published in the Science of the Total Environment showed the most effective step we can make rewilding happen is to change what we eat. They note that widespread adoption of vegan diets would be by far the most effective approach. Doing so would allow the rewilding, of course, of much more than 30% of the world's agricultural land. Next slide, please. And it would save money, as cited by the IPCC way back in 2009. Adoption of a healthy diet, which includes a meat, fish, and egg consumption cap of 90 grams per day, it's roughly a quarter of what Canadians currently eat, would reduce global emissions abatement costs by roughly 50%. It's the cheapest way we could make the change we need to survive. Next slide, please. And that's the end of my talk, and that's where Earthsave Canada, and there are our various social media links.
Thank you so much, David. Extremely thought-provoking and excellent statistics for us all to know. It was my exposure to agriculture and the destruction that it was doing in terms of destroying habitat that prompted me to become involved with the Green Party. So thank you so much for those statistics. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jason.
Okay,
Welcome, Jason.
I'm going to share my slides here. Okay, so can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much. So my presentation is called Grass-Fed Lies, the Colonial Mythology of Regenerative Meat. And so this is going to be a book project. I'm just doing the kind of the groundwork for it now, and I've submitted a grant application to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So fingers crossed I get that grant so I can get an RA, so I can get some assistance for this project. But anyhow, this is basically an overview of the proposal. So I wanted to start by talking about some products that have been released recently. In 2021, Do Good Foods introduced what they called carbon-reduced chicken. And they called themselves the first domestic chicken brand actively combating climate change. In 2022, Manitoba Pork claimed that Canadian hog farmers were leading the way to, quote, sustainable pork production. In 2023, Tyson Foods and Schweiden Sons introduced what they called their brazen climate-friendly ground beef burger. And this was a product of Tyson's Climate Smart beef program. And so these products are all part of a massive PR response to the growing concern over the climate impact of animal farming. They're concerned about their image, and so they're trying to salvage their image as desperately as they can. But this is all part of this idea that you can actually save the planet by just eating a different kind of meat. Um, Probably the most extreme version of this claim comes from this man, whom I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is Alan Savory. He's a celebrity rancher and a proponent of what is known as regenerative grazing. He's got a very famous TED Talk in which he claims, incredibly, he says that if we were to follow his particular, method of livestock farming, which he calls holistic grazing. He says we can take enough carbon out of the atmosphere and safely store it in the grassland soils for thousands of years. And if we do just that on about half the world's grasslands, we can take us back to pre-industrial levels while feeding people. So with grass-fed beef, we can solve climate change and feed the entire planet. It's kind of incredible if you think about it. And so he said in another interview that if we really want to solve climate change, only livestock can save us. Okay. Now, a number of companies have leaped on this idea of regenerative beef, regenerative grazing, regenerative ranching, regenerative animal farming. A&W has jumped on this, McDonald's, Burger King, Walmart. Walmart has even gone so far as to say that it is going to become a regenerative company by 2040. I have no idea what the hell that's supposed to mean, but they're very confident that they're going to reach this goal. Now, about Alan Savory and his particular approach to livestock farming, there have been a number of studies, and there continue to be studies about this idea that we can solve climate change by through grass-fed beef. These studies have looked at his agricultural model in detail, and they've concluded that this is just disinformation. It's not physically possible to reverse climate change to pre-industrial levels through livestock farming. And that if we were to, for example, follow his model and flood the United States with grass-fed, we would need more land than is actually available, right? Tara Garnett and her team at Oxford put out a report famously, I think in 2018 or 19, called Grazed and Confused, in which they said that no, actually, the opposite is going to happen. If you try to follow this method, it's going to result in severe environmental degradation and massive water pollution to rivers and lakes and so forth, right? So the scientific consensus is that grass-fed beef it's bad for the planet and is also responsible for climate change. And in fact, pound for pound, if you were to compare grass-fed beef to conventional beef, grass-fed beef would actually be worse for the climate because it takes longer to produce and results in more methane in the atmosphere. So notwithstanding what this guy says, because apparently last month he came out in favor of regenerative ranching, saying it's the answer to climate change, and that's how you know that it's full of nonsense. I think that the question that we need to ask is, how do we explain the persistence and popularity of this agricultural fantasy and delusion? This is what my book is going to set out to answer. And so I want to know, is it merely the outcome of aggressive industry marketing and public misunderstanding of climate science, or is there perhaps a deeper reason tied possibly to European culture, theology, and colonial history? Okay, so this concept of regeneration is incredibly fascinating to me. It seems to have taken the public imagination very, very strongly. It resonates with a lot of people. And in many ways, I think this idea of regeneration is kind of the new version of the Pink Ribbons campaign. The Pink Ribbons campaign was a sort of, gift or boon to the corporate sector. This was a kind of an ideal dream cause for corporate social responsibility, a dream kind of marketing campaign where you could show that you were being responsible to the public by, supporting breast cancer. And all of this is completely unaccountable. But I think regenerative agriculture is the new version of this sort of thing, the new ultimate corporate responsibility campaign. And so I did a bit of digging, and I found that the idea of regenerative agriculture, this concept actually originates with this guy. This is Robert Rodale. He came out of the Rodale Institute, founded by his father, Jerome Rodale, who was actually a pioneer of the organic food movement in the United States. But his son, Robert Rodale, he's the one who gave us this concept of regenerative agriculture. And I was actually able to trace the original documents in which he was putting forth this idea, introducing this idea into the public discourse. He published a piece in 1987 in the Bulletin of Science and Technology and Society called "Big New Ideas, Where Are They Today?" in which he asks the question, is it possible for there to be new big ideas, grand ideas on a really truly historic scale? And so he gives as examples ideas on the scale of evolution by natural selection, communism, psychoanalysis. There's no logical kind of order to any of these concepts, but chivalry, entropy, Thomas Kuhn's idea of scientific paradigms, existentialism, structuralism. So he's thinking of ideas on a very, very big scale. And so he said, well, I have a big idea, and my big idea is regeneration. He says, I've been working for 7 years with this one big idea, which I call regeneration. I don't mean regeneration in the sense that a salamander can regenerate its tail or that some insects can grow new legs. My conception of regeneration begins with the observation that all living systems have ways to respond constructively to disturbance. So that sounds like a scientific idea, but it's really not. He published a whole bunch of other pieces with titles like How to Think Regeneratively, proposing a regenerative culture, a regenerative way of life. He was interested in regenerative diets, regenerative medicine, regenerative healthcare, in which he was really kind of trying to develop this into a holistic lifestyle concept. And it becomes clear that this was not a scientific concept. It was not a biological concept. It was an idea of spiritual transformation. Okay. And so I learned later that the concept of regeneration actually has its origins in the New Testament. So in Matthew, for example, chapter 19, verse 28, it says, and Jesus said unto them, verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye shall also sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in Titus, but after that, the kindness and love of God, our Savior, toward mankind appeared, not by works of righteousness, which we have done, but according to his mercy, he saved us by the washing of regeneration. And the term that appears in the original Greek is palingenesia, or in English, palingenesis, which is another term for regeneration. Again, originally was a theological concept. It's only later that it became a biological concept. But the original theological concept is this spiritual rebirth through accepting Christ as Lord and Savior. And so I've been looking through this history of the idea of regeneration in Christian theology, and there's some extremely fascinating texts like The Grounds and Reasons of Christian Regeneration or the New Rebirth, The Christian Doctrine of Regeneration, the distinction between baptismal and spiritual regeneration. There's an individual component to this as well as a social component. The New Life, a study of regeneration, and then social regeneration, the work of Christianity. So I've been very fascinated about the way that this concept originates in the Bible and then gets kind of embodied in practice and put into practice in the form of animal farming. So there's a fascinating literature about this by some brilliant historians like William Cronin, for example, his book Changes in the Land, Virginia Anderson's book Creatures of Empire, about the way that settler colonizers used livestock animals in order to basically take over native land. Joshua Speck's Red Meat Republic, and then John Ryan Fisher's Cattle Colonialism. And all of these books are very fascinating illustrations of regeneration in practice. If you look at the British political philosopher John Locke, he's got a very curious concept of private property, which colonizers used to take over indigenous land. So Locke says in the two treatises of government, whatsoever he tilled and reaped, laid up and made use of before it spoiled, so that that was his peculiar right. Whatsoever he enclosed and could feed and make use of, the cattle and product was his also. But if either the grass of his enclosure rotted on the ground, it's a strange idea that grass could rot, or the fruit of his planting perished without gathering and laying up, this part of the earth, notwithstanding his enclosure, was still to be looked on as waste and might be the possession of any other. Basically, if the land is going untilled or unfarmed, then it is ripe for the taking. And so you can go ahead and claim it for yourself. And this was exactly what settler colonizers used in order to claim land that wasn't theirs and take over indigenous land. He talks about how land that is left unused will basically go to waste. It's an interesting, way to counterpose this concept of waste with the idea of regeneration. If the land is going to waste, then by taking it over and farming the land, you're helping to bring it back to life. And that's what colonizer farmers in the Americas and New Zealand and Australia, that's what they actually claim to be doing, right? And so if you look at, for example, Peter Decker's book, The Utes Must Go, he shows how the English colonizers of the U.S., they define civilization as composed of Christianity, agriculture, and capitalism. If you were not following these three, you were considered a barbarian and a savage. And this then justified driving the natives out of their land because they're wasting the land. They're not doing anything with it. They're not farming it. So they're irresponsible. Therefore, you have a God-given right to kick them out of the land, right? And so I just want to be clear. We all remember these kinds of images. We've all seen them at one point or another. This systematic program of wiping out the bison and the buffalo from the Great Plains, this was carried out by ranchers, by livestock farmers, in collaboration with the Canadian and American federal governments in order to undermine the Indigenous way of life, to break their spirit, make them completely helpless so that they could not survive, and then drive them out of the land onto reserves in Canada and reservations in the United States. But I want to be clear, this was done by cattle ranchers and livestock farmers, the kind of forefathers of the people who today are livestock farmers and cattle ranchers, right? But this ethic, this idea, this kind of lifestyle of, Christian agrarianism, this was at the root of settler colonialism in the Americas. And it is still very much the ethos of farming communities to this day in North America. The idea that by raising livestock, by raising cattle, you are doing the will of God on earth. Okay, you are carrying out God's will on earth, and you are a godly, biblical person by raising livestock. A good example of this kind of thing, who's sort of a hero to the grass-fed beef community, is this guy Joel Salatin, who I'm sure you've seen in documentaries. He's written a ton of books. He's all over the place. A very, very interesting character, which gives you a glimpse into the kind of psychology or psychosis of this kind of farmer. So this guy he denies climate change. He denies climate change. He is an anti-vaxxer who thinks that vaccines cause autism. He, in the early days of COVID, was encouraging people to get. I don't know about you. I have family who died of COVID, so I find this kind of thing horrendously offensive. But he wrote a post saying, "I want COVID," and encouraging people to go out and get COVID. If you look at his book, he wrote a book called "Folks, This Ain't Normal." In which he just comes out as an open and unapologetic misogynist. He says, back when I started selling chicken more than 40 years ago, every woman in America knew how to cut up a chicken. I'm being sexist on purpose here because I enjoy being a sexist. Most of our customers are women. Men only grunt and stand in front of the refrigerator, staring inside, mumbling, "I can't find it." Only males who are chefs can stare into the cavernous depths of the refrigerator and actually retrieve something. So 40 years ago, every woman knew how to cut up a chicken. It was part of general knowledge. It was like learning to ride a bike or read or tie your shoes. It was part of domestic skills like hammering or hammering a nail, running a washing machine, turning on a vacuum cleaner, or running a lawnmower. Today, more than half of our patrons don't even know that a chicken has bones. He says, "I've got news for you, ladies. Chicken nuggets in the shape of Dino the dinosaur are not part of a chicken's anatomy. You won't find any muscle groups titled nuggets. Boneless, skinless breast wasn't even available in the supermarket before 1970. If your recipe called for boneless, skinless breast, you did the carving yourself. And when it was done, you also had neck, backbone, wings, blah, 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 blah. You cooked and ate them." His message is basically, ladies, get back in the kitchen and make me some chicken. Literally, that's his message. Okay, and if you want to read an interesting article about him in Mother Jones, it's called "Joel Salatin's Unsustainable Myth." The man is an astonishing racist who has said terrible things about Black people and Indigenous people. And this is par for the course in this grass-fed community. Anyhow, so that's Joel Salatin, just an example of what that kind of thinking entails. Now, here's the thing. There's a very close parallel between Christian theology and the idea of regenerative grazing. They're both rooted in ideas of salvation. In Christianity, the core of it is personal salvation through Christ. In this regenerative grazing fantasy, it is ecological salvation through capitalism. Okay, so just buy our grass-fed meat and then you will save the planet, right? And this is an example of what Bertrand Russell, I think it's his book, The Conquest of Happiness, in which he says about shortcuts. He says, "I do not wish to suggest that revolutions are never necessary, but I do wish to suggest that they are not shortcuts to the millennium. There is no shortcut to the good life, whether individual or social. To build up the good life, we must build up intelligence, self-control, and sympathy. This is a quantitative matter, a matter of gradual improvement, of early training, of educational experiment. Only impatience prompts the belief in the possibility of sudden improvement." And this is my issue. This is my issue with the idea of salvation, with the idea that we can solve all of our problems with grass-fed beef. It's a cheap, lazy shortcut. It's like those advertisements that you've all seen, just eat this herb with this one weird trick, one neat trick. You can lose all of your belly fat or your toenail fungus or whatever it is. With this one neat trick, all of your problems will be solved. It's this kind of lazy thinking that allows people to think that we can solve something as colossal as climate change with something as utterly paltry and trivial as grass-fed beef, right? So my point is, every time we see these images, and there's a whole kind of commentary about the imagery, the photography, the photojournalism of animal farmers in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. Every time we encounter these images, which are considered sacrosanct, even here in Canada, if someone says, I am a fifth-generation livestock farmer, or I'm a sixth-generation, cattle rancher, it's almost like they're untouchable. Whether you are, a conservative or a liberal or NDP, it's like you're not allowed to criticize them because they're basically considered untouchable, right? But every time somebody says proudly that they are this fifth generation or sixth generation cattle rancher, livestock farmer, or whatever it is, I think there are always two questions that we need to ask. Okay. First, how did the animals get here? Because as adorable as cows and pigs and chickens are, these animals are not even native to they're not even native to the Western Hemisphere. These animals were brought here by Europeans in the modern era, subjected to what Alfred Crosby, the environmental historian Alfred Crosby, calls ecological imperialism, and then used to flood the Western Hemisphere and transform the landscapes. Okay, so first question, if they say that this is all natural, well, how did the animals get here? Secondly, how did that first generation acquire the land? Because it's not like, the natives just packed up their stuff and said, no, please take our land. They were driven out of their land forcibly. They were ethnically cleansed of their own land by those first generations. That's how they acquired the land. It was not acquired peacefully. It was acquired genocidally. What's happening right now in the Amazon, where we see cattle ranchers driving indigenous peoples out of their ancestral lands, wiping out wildlife, in some cases driving them to extinction, and then burning down the trees and then flooding the lands with livestock. That already happened in North America, but we've completely forgotten about it, and we act like this is how it's always been. That is not how it's always been. And I can give you studies. Deforestation did happen on North America. Deforestation did happen in North America. In certain Western states, like in Colorado and Utah and so on and so forth, you can actually find a bumper sticker where they don't even hide it. It says "Eat beef." The West wasn't won on salad. They're not even hiding the fact that the land was conquered by ranchers for ranchers. Right. And I just want to point out that even in North America, this is still going on. This conquest of indigenous land and the destruction of local wildlife is still happening. So in California, for example, in Point Reyes, there's one of these grass-fed ranch operations where they're trying to expand, and they're petitioning the government of California to wipe out the Tule elk, who are competing with the livestock for limited and diminishing water, right? And so they're calling on Governor Gavin Newsom to wipe out the Tule elk. And the Coast Miwok people, First Nation, they're pushing back against the ranch in order to protect their land and in order to protect the Tule elk, whom they regard as basically as their family. Okay, so when you go to the grocery store, I know that the presentations today are largely about the environment and then also about public health. I also think there's a historical component to this that we also need to remember to take into account, that when we see a food like this, it's not just that it's a menace to public health or that it's a menace to the environment. There's literally a genocidal history to this food that I think we should absolutely bear in mind, that gets obscured from this kind of feel-good farming photojournalism, which presents these family farm operations as the embodiment of wholeness, goodness, traditional family values, organic, natural, and so on and so forth, which completely obscures that violent colonial history. So I just want to end with a quote by Reviel Netz from his book Barbed Wire: An Ecology of Modernity, in which he says, talking about the final kind of conquest of indigenous land in the United States. He says, the bison were now dead. He says, First Nations had nothing to roam the plains for. The bison were now dead, replaced by railroads and farmers. And As the Indians retreated to their pitiful reservations, the cow began its trek north of Texas, eventually to introduce there an economy based in Chicago. And this, finally, was the culmination of American history in the 19th century. Texas led to Mexico, which led to Kansas, which led to the Civil War, upon whose conclusion America could move on to destroy the Indian and the bison. The final act in the subjugation of the West was underway, the transition from bison to cow. This was the immediate consequence of the Civil War. The West was open for America, and America had filled it with cows. I'm just going to end there. So thank you.
Wow, such powerful information, Jason. Thank you so much. Lots of discussion in the chat about that. Yes, incredibly powerful presentation. Thank you. And so now we move to Joyce. Eleanor Hannan. No, I'm so emotionally moved by that presentation. I'm mixing up people's names. Forgive me. Eleanor Carrara, President of the Plant-Based Cities Movement. Thank you, Eleanor.
You muted, Eleanor.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Eleanor Carrara. I'm president of the Plant-Based Cities Movement. I'm based in Montreal. And tonight I'll be talking about advancing low-carbon food procurement. So, as president of the Plant-Based Cities Movement, I acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered in Montreal is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Tiohtià:ke, now known as Montreal, has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations. We recognize and respect the enduring relationship between Indigenous peoples and this land. So our mission, what is our mission? We work to motivate cities and to mobilize citizens, governments, and institutions to go plant-based for the planet and the people. We combine research, education, advocacy to help cities and institutions adopt plant-based food procurement policies to lower their food emissions. And we were founded in response to the UN Code Red for Humanity and the IPCC report of 2022. So why cities? Cities are where 82% of Canadians live and where the majority of food is consumed, making food a major contributor to cities' consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of food emissions are related to the consumption of animal-sourced food. Cities, therefore, are one of the most important centers for tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, and chronic disease. And many cities still do not factor their food emissions into their climate action plans. So I'll talk a little bit about the impacts of animal agriculture. David did go through quite a bit of that. So there'll be a little bit of redundancy. Firstly, we slaughter between 75 to 80 billion farm animals per year. Animal agriculture accounts for 2/3 of food-related greenhouse gas emissions. It uses 83% of the global agricultural land, yet it provides only 18% of calories and 37% of protein. Deforestation, 70 to 80% of deforestation in the Amazon is used for animal agriculture. That's for grazing, feed, and infrastructure, which results in the loss of biodiversity and loss of carbon sinks. An area of land used for the production of 1 kilo of plant protein produces only 40 grams of beef. Over 15,000 liters of water are used per kilo of beef, whereas 2,000 liters are used for the production of 1 kilogram of tofu. And it's very polluting, as David had said, the air, the water, and the soil. They use growth hormones. 70% of all antibiotics are used on animals, and pathogens such as E. coli, salmonella, and other zoonotic diseases are very prevalent in factory farms. So this is the growth in the slaughter of animals between 1960 and 2022. These are the number of animals that get slaughtered every single day. And if every cow was 2 meters long and they all walked right behind each other, this line of cows would stretch for 1,800 kilometers. And this represents the number of cows slaughtered every day. Just think about those numbers. Fishing, 1 to 2 trillion wild fish are caught annually, were caught annually during 2019, and approximately half of these were used for reduction to fish meal and oil based on 2010 data. David has talked about the greenhouse gas emissions. This is just another graph showing how much higher the greenhouse gas emissions are for most animal proteins than for the plant-based proteins. A plant burger, the plant-based burger has a footprint that's 90% less than a beef burger, and plant-based milk like soy is 70% less than cow's milk. This is the environmental footprint of dairy and plant-based milks, again, across all categories: land use, greenhouse gas emissions, freshwater use, and eutrophication. You can see how much greater it is for dairy milk compared to all other milks. We talked a little bit about the land use. Producing 100 grams of protein for beef requires 163 square meters of land, whereas peas require only 3.4 square meters of land. Today, we're using 4 billion hectares of land for our agricultural system. This is the global diet. If we all went fully plant-based, we could reduce that to 1 billion. So we would save 3 billion hectares of land, and that could be used for rewilding purposes. In 2021, the United Nations Environmental Program issued a press release whereby they said that our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, and global dietary patterns need to move towards more plant-heavy diets, mainly due to the disproportionate impact of animal agriculture on biodiversity, land use, and the environment. And David has shown the same slide, and as he said, there are different figures. They're very close. So the sad state of affairs today is that 58% of our biomass is farmed animals, 36% is humans, and only 6% is wild animals, which are continuing to decline. I'll talk just quickly on the Canada Food Guide. The Canada Food Guide was developed by scientists in 2019, and the recommendation was to make half of your plate vegetables and fruit, make 1/4 of your plate whole grains, and the 1/4, that's the protein section, they say to choose protein foods that come from plants more often. So this is coming from scientists. So an important motion was passed in June of this year by the American Medical Association to address the contribution of its sector to the climate crisis. The first clause here, and there are several, recognizes that animal-based agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and supports efforts to increase and promote plant-based menu options in hospital food services for both health and environmental reasons. So I'll talk a bit about our strategic initiatives. It's essential that cities, universities, governments, and other institutions take concrete steps to reduce their food-related carbon footprint and lead by example. So we're addressing primarily the municipalities and the universities, so I'll talk to that. So in 2020, I was surprised that I looked at a few universities' menus and they did not include any plant-based options. So I started writing to the presidents of the universities, and after about 3 months, we started the Canadian University Initiative. So this is the Lancet Planetary Health saying that universities should lead on the plant-based dietary transition. By not changing their practices and policies, universities are sending a message to students, staff, and wider society that the issues associated with animal-based food are not important enough to warrant changes. Thereby, universities risk undermining a large body of scientific literature, which suggests the contrary. So we started the Canadian University Initiative with the first steering committee in December of 2020. We started with a wonderful chef from the University of British Columbia, David Spite, and a wonderful scientist, Gerard Bishop. And why did we start these steering committee meetings? Their purpose was to facilitate and provide momentum to transition Canadian universities to plant-based menus. How were we going to do that? They would share their strategies and experience and create synergy. And actually, it created a bit of a competitive spirit, what one university was doing versus another university. And why? To stop the accelerating destruction to the environment, our health, and animals. So between 2020 and 2023, we held these steering committee meetings in the fall and spring semesters. And we had speakers from dining services and sustainability from these 10 universities. And I really want to thank them. They were amazing and they volunteered. They wanted to present. And we also had other universities that worked in the background to increase their plant-based meals. Particularly the University of York and Waterloo. So this was an update that came out by the CBC this year. Now, one thing we have to be careful of, some universities under plant-based will include vegetarian. And I know, I think it was the case for the University of Toronto and University of British Columbia here. But Western, these were plant-based. Queen's plant-based, 40% of recipes were fully plant-based and 15% were vegetarian. And Concordia here, it just says basically that they plan to reduce their purchase of meat, dairy, and eggs by 30% by 2025. So this was the analysis done by the University of Victoria, who, again, I have to say was amazing. They really helped and they showed actions through their example. So they had measured their food emissions in 2019. These are by weight, and these are the proportion of food categories by emissions. So just to take the example here of the meat categories, ruminant meats were 3% by weight. But if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, they're tenfold. They were 34%. For the other meats in orange, now this is an automatic graph. It's an application by the World Resource Institute, so there's overlap when the categories are small percentages. But still, you can see that the orange category, which is the other meats, also expanded, not quite to the extent that the ruminant meats did. And of course, the plant-based, it was the opposite. Very large by weight and very small by proportion of food emissions. So these are some of the menu actions that the University of Victoria had taken after they had done this. They prioritized plant-based protein, listing these options first on all menus. And that's important. It's like the default veg concept, where you put your plant-based first and then the meat. So it's part of the nudging theory. So customers will be more apt to take the plant-based options instead of them being offered way down at the end of the line, which was often the case in the past. They reduced or replaced their beef, pork, poultry, dairy in menus by 50%. They eliminated all lamb products from their menus. They eliminated beef chili. Now they're only serving vegan chili at all outlets. And they introduced the 50-50 burger across campus. It was half plant protein and half beef. This was, mind you, back in 2022. So we're going to try to see if we can get updates on the universities next year. The other actions they took, vegan cheese was used as a default cheese. So you had to opt in if you wanted dairy cheese. And they introduced a vegan mayo, and they got rid of the regular mayonnaise completely. Other universities, for example, UBC had also started climate-friendly food labels. So did the University of Montreal. And municipal councils. Plant-based cities were working hard to get municipal councils to pass motions to go more plant-based. So we were successful with 5 of them. Montreal was also lobbied by the Sustainable Food Transition Coalition. That was in May of 2022. Brampton as well in 2022. Halton Region 2023. The District of North Vancouver 2024. And Kingston recently, October 15th, they passed their plant-based motion by a good margin of 10-3. This is the motion that was passed by Montreal in 2022. They had a lot of good suggestions in terms of increasing plant-based. We have a wonderful mayor, Valérie Plante. Now, we have to be careful with motions. Motions are motions, but what's important is that those motions then get implemented. So there needs to be a follow-up to ensure that what was in the motion does actually get implemented. Also, federal government food procurement. I felt that the government should be leading the way on this. So the mandate of the Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat Centre for Greening Government, their mandate is to provide leadership toward net zero emissions, climate resilient, and green government of Canada operations. So it took about a year to get the right contact, but then I got a really extraordinary contact who was extremely interested in the idea. So they had asked us to present to the federal government departments who had the most interest or the highest levels of spend on food in December. I presented in December 2023 and April 2024. These departments included the Treasury Board, Global Affairs Canada, the Department of National Defence, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Correctional Services Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and the Canada Border Service Agency. So there was significant interest in the presentations, which outlined the impacts of our current food system on greenhouse gas emissions and the environment, as well as the successes that PBCM had with municipalities and universities across Canada in terms of shifting towards more plant-based options. And PBCM is honored to announce that a pilot is currently being discussed for 2025. We wish to thank the Centre for Greening Government and all the participating departments for their interest, engagement, and rapid response to address food emissions as part of a comprehensive greening strategy. What we had originally asked for, and it's not to say that this is what they'll do, we'll wait and see what happens with the pilot, hopefully next year. But the original asks were to transition 50 to 75% of all animal-based food purchases to plant-based by the end of 2025, to promote climate-friendly food across federal offices, agencies, and events, and to promote sustainable food innovations. Additionally, we requested the reform of food procurement policies to include food sustainability and reduced food waste as explicit goals of federal food procurement policy, require that the social cost of carbon be factored into all food procurement procedures, and require vendor transparency as to carbon emissions related to food supply. But like I said, we'll have to wait and see. These were asked, not necessarily what they will do next year. So we know the climate crisis is escalating, our forests and wildlife are disappearing, and the slaughter of farm animals is growing. So we want more membership. We want more membership across Canada. We want volunteers that are determined because we really don't have much time left, and we have to go after the big institutions to make a big impact. If you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, please go to our site and you can write to us at hello@plantbasedcities.org. So we would really appreciate your help, especially if you've got some skill sets. We need them. We're completely a volunteer organization, so any help you can give us would be very much appreciated. Okay, so now I'll move to a video. This was produced by the University of Victoria at the end of 2022. That was 2 years after we had started. So let me just go to that video. Hang on. Okay.
The University of Victoria is leading Canadian universities shifting menus to reduce our carbon.
You're going to need to change your share because we can't see it.
UBC.
Sorry?
We can't see the video. You need to change what the window you're sharing.
Oh, okay. It was just, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Let me go back.
We can still see the sidebar and
Yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute and then I'll start again. Okay.
thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Why isn't that working? Okay, sorry, I'm gonna back up here. Okay.
Ranked
Yes.
second in the world for climate action and addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Still, we're just seeing the opening page.
Hi, I'm Tony Eastman. I'm the executive chef for the University of
Yeah,
Victoria. We're in our
You're
brand
showing
new.
the slideshow, not the YouTube video, Eleanor. You need to go to the window with the YouTube video.
I thought that's where I was, but okay.
So we were seeing the slideshow.
Oh. Oh dear. Okay, hang on.
Well, thank you. Well, I'll just take this moment while we sort this out to thank those of you putting excellent links into the chat box. Thank you, Debbie, for the link on should we have wolves or livestock on public lands, and sharing your comments in the chat. But get ready for your questions and to further the discussion once we get away from the slideshow and into the video. That's
Okay.
what we want to see. Thank you.
Get
Thank you,
down?
Eleanor. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Building. This building is passive house, LEED Gold. So we had to do a lot of changes in the kitchen. So we're focused on induction cooking. Everything that we've been working on is to try and lower our carbon emissions in this building. And I think the focus on lowering our beef proteins to a minimum will be a good start for us. I'm standing in front of the Greens kiosk where we serve 100% vegan options. It's the first thing you'll see when you come into this area. The a la carte menu is up on the board, and you see the Kung Pao California Bowl, the Chai Masala Curry, and the Tex-Mex wrap. The a la carte menu does change weekly. We have our daily chili. It's such a good vegan chili that you actually don't have to add any meat to it because it's so good. All around, we have the shawarma, we have the grill, we have a pizza, we have a deli, and then we have a stir-fry section, plus a lot of grab and goes here at the university. Each one of our kiosks will have a vegetarian option in each area. The other thing that we focused on in our shawarma is we do a halal chicken. We also do a portobello mushroom shawarma, plus we do a falafel shawarma too. We also have the pizzas where we do serve a vegetarian and a vegan pizza. And then once again, our sandwiches have a large options of any vegan, vegetarian options. In our grills and our food service areas, we default to a vegan cheese, a Daya cheddar. And then also we have our stir fry station. All our sauces except for our pad thai sauce is vegan. We're at the grill. This is our 50-50 burger. It's 50% ground beef and 50% pea protein. It's a 5.33 ounce patty. It's one of the burgers that was started by David Spite at UBC to lower the beef consumption here at the universities. I was very fortunate to go to UBC with my executive Sue, Chris Bailey, to Forward Food. This is where it first started for us in trying to lower our beef consumption. So with Forward Food, we basically moved towards greener by default to kind of amalgamate everything together to make sure we're all focused on more green options here at the universities.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. Well, yes, I certainly value myself, and the Green Party does as well, and our many guests here this evening, this incredible arrangement of information that you've shared with us, just the impacts of our food choices and what change we can make in the not only the choices that we make, but how we influence agriculture and the impacts it has. So folks, please, let's have some discussion. Who would like to ask a question? Or Laura, were there any questions in the, okay, here we have Chris H. Questions for Eleanor. Doesn't have the mic or the video set up. Great work, impressive results, especially University of Victoria and City of Montreal. I imagine it's easy with enthusiastic chefs, but what if they are not so enthusiastic? What is your organization's strategy to make these changes happen? How do you get buy-in? What can we learn? And then secondly, what is your organization's relationship with Plant-Based Treaty, which has similar initiatives? Is there some cross-pollination synergy there?
Okay, so I'll start with the first question with respect to the universities. Like I said, it was easier than I thought it would be. Like David Spite, when I first started, wanted to do this, and he was thanking me instead of me thanking him. I said, I couldn't believe it. David is thanking me. So, and then I had the next meeting in May of 2021, and I got 3 chefs. Like, people wanted to participate. And as it grew, there was, I won't say a competition, but you know, that kind of friendly spirit of competition. This is what we're doing. So I think they felt it was important for them to share what they had done. So yeah, it was a lot easier than I thought. And then what year was it? In 23? Yeah, one of the chefs from one of our largest universities says, why don't we have a brainstorming session? So we got several chefs together. We had Greener by Default. We had Forward Food, and we talked about the different ways that we could increase plant-based food. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the beginning and end of it. It was easier than I thought. And we would like to maybe have a survey next year to see where are we? Because, you know, they're fragmented. For example, University of Toronto has several campuses. So sometimes they'll report on one campus. So we, you know, it's maybe whatever, let's say it would be 50% for that campus, but it may not necessarily be 50% for the whole university. The original ask when I started this was to get to 60% within 2 years. I kind of thought that was reasonable. So I'm not sure if we're there, but a lot of them were starting from way down. You know, some may not have had any purely vegan options. So hopefully we can get some results next year. With respect to the plant-based treaty and the plant-based cities, no, we're not affiliated. We have a different strategy. We work more on the policy side with various institutions. We don't do street activism and so on. We're really policy oriented. Yeah, so I hope that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Excellent. Other folks that would like to comment or share their questions? Yes, go ahead, Laura, and then Audrey.
Thank you. Yeah, just this question for Jason. You showed quite a few books there, and I look forward to reading yours. I'm just wondering if there's, say, one book that you would recommend to delve into the history of regenerative agriculture and sort of how it all evolved.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that there is a whole lot on the history of the idea, but I mean, you could look at you could look up scattered articles out there on Robert Rodale and his early publications in these obscure journals on the idea of regenerative agriculture. But I don't know that anyone has written a history. I mean, that's the point of my project is to write that history.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess you could I can send you some references to those articles, or you'll have to just wait 2 or 3 years for my book.
Well, good. We certainly wish you the best of luck with your grant applications, Jason, and that we can look forward to reading your book and circulating it among our community.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'm sorry, I didn't write down the second woman that had her hand up, but I said after Laura.
It's me, Audrey.
Audrey, yes. Please go ahead, Audrey.
Hi, my name's Audrey Logan. I have not been in a store now for 20 years. I grow as well as I do permaculture. I do traditional foods. And there's so many aspects to plant-based foods that I find very troubling. Very much, my vegan doctor will not touch a lot of that plant-based so-called meat because of the amount of processing it takes to make it.
Yes.
As well as, you know, I've worked on a farm when I was a kid. I saw how damaging the farming methods were and are, the monoculture that is being practiced. I think a lot of it's the practices that colonization brought. Indigenous farmers have been here for thousands of years, thousands. So if you've eaten tomatoes, potatoes, corns, beans, chilies, peanuts, chocolate, a whole myriad of foods, your everyday foods, well, potatoes, of course, those are all indigenous cultivation. So beforehand, there was none of that food elsewhere. So for thousands of years, we had grown it here, corn alone in Canada for 10,000 years. And, the practices that we followed were more of a permaculture method. So we don't water. I have never watered my growing area. I produce nonstop. I seed 3 to 4 times a year. In fact, I'll be seeding next week because I do winter seeding and such. So it's like, why can't we use the old knowledge with the new technology? Because if you've ever followed a tractor doing wheat and grains and pulses and that, the amount of grease and everything is dripping, please. It's going just to a plant-based diet is not going to solve things. And also, what do we do with all the animals left over? What do you do about all the products that are byproducts that are made from animals? Anyone here use soap? Well, that's made from animal fat. WD-40, that's from fish oil. So many of our modern day products are based upon many ingredients from rendered animal byproduct, from bone meal to and fertilizer. A lot of it's used for weaponry as well. That's what all those bison bones were used for. And we had millions of bison roaming and had no fart issue.
Yes.
There was no gas issue. And we had millions of them. And yet we also farmed as well. And we had, they estimate at least 70 million Indigenous people here before landing and such. So it can be done. It's just a matter of, like we did a test area of making squash flour, 20 by 20 spot. Turned out from 1 acre, we would have had over 100 pounds of squash flour alone, let alone the beans and the corn, plus the sunflower seed as well. So we would have had 5 times the crop going, not having that monoculture. And as for the doctrine of discovery saying that they can dominate the land because of its use, that is a biblical aspect. And that is a law. That's the doctrine of discovery. So until you get rid of the doctrine of discovery, which the Pope will never do, because that allows them ownership of these lands and many lands elsewhere. So you need to really, instead of, I feel, putting it all onto a person's diet is really, I think it's just not as healthy to do. We need to change whole systems.
Yes. Systemic change is required, Audrey. Yes.
A big change. I have no garbage. I take garbage out maybe once a year because I have no boxes from food. I have no cans from food. I don't have any of that. I don't have to go to the store. I dehydrate all my food and it will store up to 30, 40 years. I just did a whole bunch of squash for flour. I won't have to do squash now for 10 years.
Wow.
So, and the use of a dehydrator, $1 for 24-hour run. And I can get 3 items fully done in that time. So I think there's a bigger change than just plant-based diet because I don't follow just plant-based. I do eat meats and fish, locally sourced, of course, but also ethically sourced in many ways as I can. There are places you can find it. Now with the internet, just type it in, Fire Wheat Food Hub in Manitoba here,
Yes.
Adagio Acres. They have a grain CSA. You can get all the grains that are locally grown. Never mind buying quinoa from other countries. We got quinoa growing right here. We have
Thank you so much,
many
Audrey.
things.
Yeah, these are important contributions to this discussion. Appreciate your speaking up. And I also appreciate all the work that you've done in the community for so many years. So thank you so much for joining this evening and sharing this perspective. because you raise questions that have come to me because I know the indigenous way of agriculture. I feel in so many ways we need to go back to it, but there was a harmony with the animals on the land as opposed to the way animal agriculture is now.
Oh yeah,
So thank
because
you
you
for that.
can't have a whole bunch of deer because they get diseases, same as cattle, same as many other animals. If we don't cull them,
Yes,
you have to cull them. You have to manage them responsibly, though.
yes, thank you so much. We do have to move on to some other questions. Debbie, your hand is up, but before I go to you, we do have, let's see, the question, I think it's from Liz on out where I live, the only green spaces left are cow-calf. The rest of the bush is being pushed for sometimes corner to corner soy. Is a balanced approach a possibility? So there's that question from Liz. I'd like our panelists to speak about that. And I do think the balanced approach for me, Liz, is also supporting organic production in that it's much more humane treatment of the animals on the way to moving away from depending on animal agriculture, moving back to a more indigenous balanced base. Because I frequently cite that the thousands of years indigenous people fed themselves without destroying the environment, as opposed to the damages that have occurred in the last 200 years with colonial agriculture.
Well, I concur, but with everything chopped into 1 square mile and then everything, the land's just divided and, absolutely altered beyond recognition.
Yeah.
Like it's, so any bit of, I guess my favorite point about this is any bit of marginal land that's still out there in the southern prairies, especially where I live in the South Central, is original land. It's never been tilled, and it's being tilled now to make room for larger farms, and animals seem to be leaving the picture quite. The small cow calves are disappearing, probably because there's bigger ag going on further west. But
yes,
they seem to be important for the biodiversity and the cooling effect they have on our immediate biozone, like our bioregion. So I think balance is important,
Yes, thank you, Liz.
I understand what you're saying about.
I'd like
Okay,
to
and
note
Dennis, go ahead.
that 90% of soy used in North America is fed to farmed animals, not to humans. So
Right.
by dramatic animal agriculture, we could dramatically reduce soy use as well, of course. Same with corn.
People are eating more soy than they used to.
Biofuel.
Yes. Dennis has a question for our panelists. What can we learn from Denmark insofar as how their government is promoting plant-based agriculture and healthy nutrition? And then we'll go to you, Debbie. Responses from our panelists to Denmark and how they've implemented plant-based agriculture.
Well, Denmark, okay, I don't know who wants to. I'll step in since no one else seems to be. Denmark has recently passed law to basically buy out some farmers to reduce the amount of animal farming happening in Denmark. That's their main push there, because they realize how much damage is being done and how much animals they have. How many they've got, I think, among the highest, if not the highest, density of farmed animals per area in the country, in the world, and they realize how much damage that's doing, and they're moving away from it. They're actually paying money to farmers to get them to transition out of it and to move towards more sustainable diets.
Yes, their hog production has been a big negative impact on their landscape. So yes, that's an issue. Thank you. Okay, Debbie, please proceed.
Yeah, it's not a question so much as just a few comments regarding, some mention was made of plant-based meat, and I don't think anybody is suggesting that we replace animal flesh with plant-based meats. As we saw from the Canada Food Guide, the emphasis is on whole plant foods, not processed foods. But even those processed plant meats are better for your health than eating animal flesh. And in terms of things like soaps and whatnot, there are plenty of non-animal soaps and other items out there. I mean, we were talking about looking things up on the internet. Just put anything that you're looking for and put vegan or plant-based, and boom, you'll find it, including veganic agriculture, which is growing organically without any animal inputs at all, like no manure, no blood meal, no feathers and such. And part of the imbalance when we're talking about the wild critters out there, a lot of that is due to the fact that we've killed off all the predators, which would have kept them in balance. And much of that was done at the behest of animal agriculture, and sometimes done in the most heinous of ways, including, snaring and poisoning.
Yes, Debbie, very, very sad history that we have in agriculture. I just want to point out another comment from Audrey, which I think is really important, that 40% of vegetable production is wasted and doesn't get to the market. And our waste of food in North America is just immoral as far as I'm concerned. Whenever anyone says we can't support organic agriculture because it won't feed the world, I always say production is not the issue, it's distribution is the issue. And we just have to move away from this, and Jason, the history that you provide and the context that you're putting it in, I think is so needed and so important, that our agriculture is very based on colonialism, and not only the rape of the land, but the genocide of the first peoples who were here. And it makes me wonder. I mean, I come from a family that rode a lot of horses. I used to be a barrel racer. My dad was a big cowboy. And now I'm wondering what message I'm sending with that cowboy hat that I love to wear. It's almost a symbol of the destruction and the stealing of the land from the First Nations people. But I'll have to reflect on that somewhat, if there's some aspect of it that I can find to represent justice in a way. We've reached the top of the hour, and this has been as moving and intense a presentation from our guests as I thought and knew it would be. So I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for your work and for your time and sharing this message with you, and wish you the best. I hope, Eleanor, that we do have more universities joining, maybe with Jason at the University of Winnipeg. They might be interested in joining your university program. And I certainly know that the U of Vic program did inspire my brother, who was a professor at the University of Victoria, to become a vegan many years ago. And his basis of becoming a very strict vegan was on minimizing his impact on the environment. So I do think that the strategy of having the universities is an excellent one, and we will encourage our members and others who are interested to support your work as well. So yes, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Dennis shares that. Thank you very much, Dennis, for pulling this together. Your leadership as the president of the Green Party of Manitoba is so appreciated. Yes, this was an absolutely sterling discussion. Thank you all for joining us. At one point, we had 30 guests. We're down a bit now, but that was, I think that really reflects the timeliness of this topic. And even though we have to go deeper, as Audrey says, it's not just our personal choices, but we have to be working for systemic change, as I realize so many of us on this call tonight are striving to do. But it's easier to change ourselves and have impact on those immediately around us than to change these big structures that we know are just so destructive and not leading to the kind of compassion and care for each other and the earth that we need. So I'll just leave it there with a profound gratitude to our panelists, to Audrey, to everyone who's joined us this evening. Just amazing presentation. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Be well, travel well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.